Once upon a time, on a quiet little farm, a mother duck sat on her nest. One by one, her eggs began to hatch. Quack, quack, said the fluffy yellow ducklings as they came out.
We're going to do a whole episode in English because I have an awesome guest today, Mr. Sam Hughes. And Sam is a voice actor from England. And Sam, I think like most of the Finns, like me, I want to know, what the hell are you doing in Finland? You could be doing this work anywhere in the world. So you picked Finland. And why?
I love that so many Finns ask that question, not just to me, but to many internationals. They're like, but why here?
Yeah, it's in our nature to hate our own home country, kind of like.
Well, first of all, I love it. But originally I moved here for work. So my day job is as an audio designer for video games.
Oh,
and
cool.
I moved here for a job back in 2018 to work at Remedy.
Okay.
And so I was a sound designer there for many years. So that brought me to Finland. And then I signed up with some voice agencies while I was here. And everything kind of snowballed from there, really. And I've built a life here. I love it here. And I'm fortunate enough that I still get to work here as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, you do a lot of stuff. I mean, some of
good summary.
Yeah. I mean, some of the viewers might have spotted you on social media.
Mm-hmm.
You do a lot of like short clips on Instagram, like imitating like Arnold and Jason and owls.
Oh yeah, so that was an owl trend. Yeah, I have to be honest. Some of the trends I don't even know where they come from.
Oh yeah,
I just find them fun. So there was a random trend on social media where people doing owls but as impressions.
Yeah.
So yeah, I did Castiel from Supernatural as an owl.
Okay. Yeah. When I was scrolling through your social media feed, I thought that okay, I don't watch Lord of the Rings. I don't know any of that. I mean, I know the Gollum.
Yeah, Gollum. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that. Oh yeah. But I have not seen any of the movies.
You've not seen Lord of the Rings?
None.
Okay.
Not even the first one.
There's like 90% of your viewer base right now going, what?
I know, but we've gone this through with a friend before. No Hobbits, and actually I haven't seen any Star Wars.
I was literally about to ask, what about Jedis?
Yeah, no Star Wars.
No Hobbits or Jedis.
I've seen the three original.
Okay, well that's what you need to watch. That's fine.
Really?
Yeah. No, stick with us.
And you've been trending like no tomorrow. Like you had like 8 million views in some of your.
Yeah, that was always Arnold Schwarzenegger, who I'm a big fan of, as you know. That was the Schwarzeneggers of the Ring video that I voiced. So
yeah.
I found a deepfake video on YouTube that was just all the faces of the Council of Elrond in that scene were replaced with Arnold Schwarzenegger, but they hadn't done the voice. It was still all the original voices. So I reached out and was like, hey, do you mind if I use this video to make some content? Because I do a great Arnold Schwarzenegger impression. And they were like, yeah, fine. Yeah, sounds good.
Wow.
So I just kind of ripped the video. I took it from them. And then I revoiced all the characters and redubbed all the lines as Arnold Schwarzenegger myself. So, and then, that one, it wasn't even the highest quality video or anything that I posted. I just posted it for fun. And I was a, little nobody at the time with like barely 1,000 followers or something on Instagram.
When did you find out you're able to do all these voices and able to learn and pick up on the nuances of the voices? When did you learn about that?
So from quite a young age, to be honest. So I've been an Arnold Schwarzenegger fan and, fandoms in general, been a fan since very young age. So about 4 was when I watched Terminator 2 because my dad was terrible with age ratings. So I was going around on my little red tractor singing Bad to the Bone, trying to flip my sunglasses.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So that started very young. And I used to quote all my favorite films all the time. So at the time, it was like Terminator 2, Transformers, the movie from 1986. And I loved the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I've been like obsessed with video games like my whole life as well. So I was always quoting my favorite characters, always quoting my favorite scenes when I would play with friends, and I'd always try and do accents and stuff. So from quite a young age, I was mimicking things.
Yeah.
But then as I grew older, that was when I kind of started realizing, I don't know, maybe around 10 or 11 that somebody has this job. Somebody
Oh,
voices these characters.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh my God, that's like the coolest thing ever. So ever since that age, I've always wanted to voice animation and video games. And that's where the original kind of love came from. And then I just kind of kept doing it, really. And then with the Arnold Schwarzenegger one, it was awful in the beginning. You know, I was like a 10-year-old trying to do, I can't even do it as bad as I could.
Oh yeah, but that's
it's such a habit now.
Your puberty has not kicked in.
Yeah,
by
exactly.
That age,
so I was probably like, oh, I'm trying to talk like this up here, sounding like younger Arnold.
Oh yeah,
but
teenage Arnold.
It was just something like, because I'm a musician as well, and I have an ear for patterns.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's part of my ADHD or not as well, but I really kind of like, I know when it's the same and I know when I can match it. And I know a lot of times how to figure it out, even if I can't do it. Obviously, there's some impressions I just can't do. Nobody can do every single impression.
What I found funny was that you couldn't really do like, no, that's bad. That's more Patrick Warburton, but I mean, Sly.
Stallone, yeah, he's difficult. I think I could figure it out if I spent time on it. But you got it like right down here.
Yeah, that's the funny thing, that some voices might be easier, like naturally. Like, okay, I can only do the growl. I can. Oh, okay. I'll take it back. I cannot do even the growl right now, but. I think it's like semi-decent, but you know, I do know there's a lot more to voice acting that actually doing like one or two words or a catchphrase.
Yeah,
and you have to act with the voice. You have to sing. You have to be able to act like you're eating something with and doing the voice. But you know, it's hard.
Yeah, and impressions for me are more of a, like, I love them. I find them fun. And I did it more to entertain my friends most of the time, right? Because, you know, do like funny little ideas or stupid stuff, or like video game impressions, and then just we'd make fun of like certain things that we love. And impressions are not usually where you get a lot of voiceover work, okay?
Yeah.
So like voiceover work is more your natural voice or unique characters. And again, you have to become that character in every way.
Yeah, you have a really like... I think a natural and soothing voice.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you. I'll take that. And you know, so impressions for me are more to expand my repertoire of voices that I can do, because I often say that a bad impression is the gateway to a new character. Because you get to flex your voice in different ways, and I was always trying to do creature sounds as well. Creature sounds is actually one of the first gigs I ever got.
Oh yeah,
doing like little creatures and monsters for video games and stuff like that. So.
I bet you saw Gremlins when you were a kid.
One of my favorite movies.
Oh yeah. Wasn't it the Michael Winslow who did most of the voices?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It's so...
smoke, something like that. That almost sounded like Cartman doing the gizmo. This smoke, screw you guys, I'm going home.
I like it. It's like a Finnish Cartman.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I love Gremlins, and holy shit, I think I saw the movie like 10 times, but you know,
I watched it a lot as a kid.
Every time I saw the movie, I was so afraid to go to sleep.
You scared of Gremlins?
I was, but
wow, okay.
I was like, it was back in the 80s.
Yeah.
No, it could not have been.
I mean, it came out in the 80s, I think.
I was born in 77, so it sure was in the 80s. Yeah.
Yeah.
But not in the 70s, obviously. But yeah, like I was so afraid. I mean, the Gizmo guy was so cute, but
I love Gizmo,
the badass gremlin with the stripe.
Oh yeah, I think he's literally called Stripe.
Okay, yeah.
The one with the mohawk.
That figures.
Yeah. I mean, I watched a lot of horror in my life, and I have to admit, I had a lot of nightmares growing up, probably because of it, because I played a lot of horror games and watched a lot of horror movies, but I love them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I also have quite a vivid imagination, so when I was younger, like that was good and bad when it came to trying to sleep. So,
yeah. And I think every single person who's stumbled on your social media knows your love of Resident Evil series, the games.
Yeah. I mean, Resident Evil is very close to my heart. Again, I've been a fan since I was like, I don't know, 9 or 10. I got Resident Evil 2 with a secondhand PS1, and I was too scared to play it the first time I had it.
Yeah.
So I had to wait till I was a little bit older and I was braver to play it, because the game just starts you off in the middle of the zombie apocalypse. And I was just like, ah. So, but ever since, I've been in love with Resident Evil. I even have a Resident Evil tattoo.
You do?
Yeah. So this is I have a thing for numbers as well.
What's that?
Codes. So this is the code to the East Office safe.
Oh, shit.
In Resident Evil 2 on PS1. 2236.
So I'm pretty sure no one recognizes that tattoo. Like,
that's why I like it, because like you only know if you know, right?
Yeah. So what's that? 2236.
Yeah.
Oh. Wow.
So yeah, in case you ever need the code for the East Office in Resident Evil 2.
So every time you play, you have to actually check your wrist.
Yeah. Well, this was like, so this is why I got it. It was also like the first number I remember ever memorizing, like fully. Like I've known it my whole life now.
Okay.
So it's kind of like it's weird to say, but it's a special number for me for many reasons. So,
yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't. I do, of course.
Yeah, you know, tattoos are for you; they're not for the world. So,
yeah.
How you do them?
On one of the videos you've posted on social media, you kind of like gave a little lesson, small mini lessons, like about for people who want to be a voice actor. Like, one of them was learn to hear many no's.
Oh yeah, to get used to rejection.
Yeah.
Rejection is like 90% of the job, I always say.
Yeah.
Because it's not like, you need a bit of thick skin for this kind of career, because you're going to be auditioning against like hundreds of other people.
Mm-hmm.
So voice acting is the most accessible it's ever been, with all the decent equipment these days, and like even home soundproofing is easier than it used to be.
Yeah.
Mics are better at isolating and stuff like that. But it's also the most saturated it's ever been.
Yeah.
Because it's so accessible. So a lot of things make you stand out, and even if you stand out and are an amazing voice actor, it doesn't mean you're going to get the gig. So
yeah, you might not be the one for the role,
and that's it.
I mean, the casting directors, they must have a vision of a voice, and you might be the best, like you told me that you might be the best in doing voices, but if you're not right for the part, then it goes for the guy who or girl who is right for the part.
And that's exactly it. So like, it's never personal.
Yeah.
Like, it's always like the right fit for the character.
Yeah.
So your performance might even be amazing, but you just don't fit the character, or the sound is not what they're looking for.
Now, when you expand that a little bit, it's kind of same thing with the relationships.
Yeah.
I mean, you might
it's
not
the same
be
with a lot of things.
You might not be the right one for like 5 million women, but then when you find the one or two, or when you find the one, it's enough.
Yeah, and that's
kind
it.
of
It's the same with a
reverse.
lot of relationships, friendships, people. You know, if you force it, it's not going to go very well. So same with voice acting. Like, if you push too hard and you put too much pressure on it, then you're going to cave quite quickly. And you know, mental health is a big thing in this sector. Like, so it can be tough. Even I struggle some days. Not everyone can handle it all the time, because it's a long slog for a lot of people to try and get to a point where you voice act regularly and get, you know.
Yeah, you still got the gig at Remedy?
No, I don't work at Remedy anymore. I work at Medical. So I'm an audio lead for mobile games.
Oh, awesome. So, I mean, the stress must be so much at a lower level when you got the basic income covered.
I mean, most voice actors have a day job. Or,
they do?
Yeah. Unless they're sort of like a high-profile voice actor. And even then, they have other revenue streams to fill in the gaps, because the problem is you never know when the gaps are coming.
Yeah.
Even if you're a really kind of like regular working voice actor, you need to fill the gaps, because you're a freelancer at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So you still have the same issues that freelancers face. So a lot of voice actors will do cons, they will do signings, they will do like Streamily, or they'll do live streams, content creation, gaming streams, all this sort of stuff. Because you need other sources of income, because you need passive income or regular income to be a base layer, even if you're a regular working voice actor. Because regular working voice actors comes in waves. Some people have had regular gigs for years, if not decades, that's fine. But for a lot of new talent, it kind of peaks and troughs.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, even, you know, you see interviews and stuff with actors on high-profile games, and even they're saying that, like, after a massive release, you think that they're going to be like, oh my God, everyone's hiring them, but they have a lull.
Yeah,
So.
and it's also crazy. Like it was just like yesterday when I saw this guy who does these awesome breakdowns of harmonies.
Oh yeah.
He does these compilations where he takes like a popular song and he builds the harmonies one by one, and there might be like nine, even 10 layers to the song.
I love those.
And I think he had like 0.8 million subscribers in YouTube, and some of his videos were like 34 million views or something.
Oh, wow, yeah.
But you know what? Like I watched his latest videos because I wanted to see if there was something that I really would enjoy, and he had videos with under 1,000 views.
Yeah.
With that amount of subscribers, it feels insane. I mean, I got like plus 4,000 subscribers on YouTube, and usually like my bad video is like 3,000-4,000, and my good videos are like above like 20,000.
It's about the type of content though. So the reason people have subscribed are obviously his harmony layer videos, right?
Yeah.
So if he does something different, then
he doesn't. He doesn't.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the most amazing part. He obviously he found his niche, but I don't know. It seems the algorithm has totally fucked him over.
I mean, it completely depends. You know, I've had hits and misses all over the place on social media.
Yeah.
Which is why I've given up trying to be too strategic with it.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah.
I used to, when I first started out, you know, I was trying to build a following and I was trying to figure out what my regular thing would be or what my niche would be.
Yeah.
And I actually did better once I gave up and was just posting whatever I felt like.
Yeah, and also I think like whenever you feel like, because if you're on a tight schedule, you promise your audience that on every Friday I'm going to post a video, and what there might be weeks or months that you don't have much to say.
Yeah,
and that's me. That's completely me. I might go like anywhere from 2 to like 4, even 5 months without posting anything. Like I think my last video was in maybe like last November or December or something like that.
Depends on the type of content you make, because I do a lot of short form, so it's very easy to just throw something out on social media.
Yeah.
And like even this morning, like so a friend of mine, another voice actor, we were talking about this yesterday even, where we're saying like, how do you come up with your content? How do you plan it, or how do you whatever? And I am way more chaotic than most people I know, because this morning even I had an idea and I just went, sorry, I've got time, and I quickly recorded it in 5 minutes and threw it out on social media.
Yeah,
because it just hit me. I was inspired.
Yeah,
and you know, I've got to strike while the iron's hot, and I don't get too precious about how perfect it needs to be anymore. I've posted so many times now that, you know, with TikTok and Instagram and all the other stuff, the quality isn't always what matters. Like the recent hit I had that was like over 2 million views now, the how to do Arnold Schwarzenegger in 15 seconds.
Yeah.
That was an old video that I already posted about a year ago. I just reposted it, trimmed it a little bit, and added some captions. Yeah. And just took off. And the quality is not even that good. Like the video quality, I looked at it and I was like, it looks like it's not even HD or anything like that.
Yeah.
And so that kind of stuff, it matters a lot less than you think.
Yeah, I think like it's a very bad idea for anyone to like quit your day job after one
Don't
viral.
do it too soon.
Yeah.
No, because like
I wouldn't do it like never.
No, and it's funny because like on Instagram was where the Schwarzeneggers of the Ring really took off originally.
Yeah,
it was part 1 of like the 3 parts of the scene that I did, and it hit 8 million nearly. And you know, if people hear that and they assume that, oh my god, so how much did you make and what have you done with it and what do you do now?
Yeah,
and I'm like, it literally just got me a couple of thousand followers.
Yeah,
that is all it did.
Yeah.
It didn't make me any money or anything like that.
Yeah.
And even when I put it on YouTube, of course there's copyright strikes because of the music, so it doesn't make any money there either. So it's really good for building a following if you go viral, but going viral, I think it also depends why you go viral, right? Because everyone just started stealing my video because I'm not in it. So everyone was just posting it on their channels, and it's been cycling around a load of other places. So I even have people questioning me, like that it's someone else or that it's AI.
Yeah.
And I have to keep kind of like proving, and I'm going to do a behind the scenes video at some point to be like, look, here is the recording session. Here are the voice lines that I recorded.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And there's this one guy that Joe, I don't know.
Godet.
Yeah. Oh,
He does an amazing Arnold as well.
Yeah. And he had a bunch of like naysayers and suspicious viewers who thought that it's all AI.
Yeah.
And then he did one tutorial.
Yeah.
And I absolutely fucking nailed the Arnold voice.
Yeah, yeah. He
was so good. And I mean, I was okay. I do know that people can really do the voice, so I never had my doubts about it being an AI. But I mean, still, I was blown away by the.
Well, his accuracy is like unmatchable.
Yeah, it's amazing, and also he spends a lot of time doing the actual AI part with the facial changes
with,
and
Brian Monarch,
and doing the Michael Jackson videos and all of that. I don't know if you ever watched it, but I posted you a compilation of Mel Blanc.
Oh, Mel Blanc is a legend, like absolute legend. He's like the original voice actor.
And he did so many voices, and the craziest part is that all the cartoons were made like back in the 40s, and maybe some during the 50s.
Yeah,
and they are still so fucking funny. I mean,
and so iconic.
I mean, duck thief and a rabbit thief, and
yeah, exactly.
I mean, those cartoons they are pretty much immortal.
I mean, everyone talks about Seth MacFarlane in Family Guy, and he's incredible, right?
He's awesome,
doing all the voices, talking to himself. But Mel Blanc was the original for that.
He was, of course.
The craziest one for me is Bugs and Daffy with the whole rabbit thieving and all this other stuff.
Duck thieving.
They're like fighting with each other, but then they're pretending to be each other. And I'm just like that. So he's doing Bugs doing an impression of Daffy, and then Daffy doing an impression of Bugs, it's mind blowing what he did. He's crazy. So I grew up watching a lot of those, and there was also a video that I had. I forget the name of it now, but it's something where Bugs goes through like the Hall of Fame of like Warner Brothers cartoons over the years, and it mentions Mel Blanc and stuff.
Oh, really?
Like that. Yeah. It's very good, and has a lot of different scenes from cartoons over the years.
Yeah, I remember one Daffy cartoon where they absolutely broke the fourth wall.
They keep deleting the
the
drawing stuff. That's one of the best cartoon episodes.
Where's the rest of me?
Yeah, exactly.
It was so good. And oh my god, I love Daffy. I mean,
Daffy's one of the best.
It's and also Bugs, but I mean, Daffy is he's the OG for me. I mean, I
love his emotional outbursts.
Yeah,
so
and in Finland they used to show the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote every morning. It was like Daffy or Bugs or Roadrunner, or Wile E. Coyote.
I mean, I grew up on cartoons, right?
Yeah, me too.
All of these stuff, Warner Brothers, and then Hanna-Barbera as well.
Yeah, and hey, let's elaborate more about like Seth MacFarlane.
Yeah,
I mean, how talented is the guy?
I mean, come on.
Okay, let's say
insanely talented.
All the voices.
Yeah,
he's got a whole bunch of them, like dozens.
But it's not just that; it's the improv, the writing,
and the singing and the composing. Yeah. I mean, he can play.
I mean, he's an insane talent, and of course, like an inspiration for a ton of voice actors. A lot of people are very impressed, and a lot of people try and do Family Guy impressions as well to try and emulate him.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, him, and so like going back to the idols, like another one of mine is Frank Welker, and
I don't know him. Sorry.
So he's a phenomenal voice actor who's been around since like I think the 50s, maybe 60s. He just did a lot of the original stuff, so like Scooby and Shaggy and Fred in Scooby Doo, and then like he's done loads over the years, Slimer and Ray in the original Ghostbusters, and then there's like so many different characters. Like even in Aladdin, the Disney's Aladdin, he's Abu, but he's also the Cave of Wonders and a few other characters. He was like a million Transformers. That's why I knew him first, because he's Megatron in the original Transformers cartoon. Yeah, but he also does like 20 or 30 other Transformers and has done ever since. he's crazy talented. He even did lions in Lion King. He did a lot of like roaring and stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he does crazy creatures. Curious George the monkey, he was.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's phenomenal. But also, is it Tom Kenny as well, who does all the SpongeBob voices? And then another huge inspiration is Jim Cummings. Jim Cummings.
Okay, you know so much more of the actors than
Rob
I
Manson.
do. Yeah,
like there's so many great voice actors out there.
The one guy that you must know is Jay Farrow. How do you pronounce the last name? Like the black guy who used to be on Saturday Night Live.
Oh, I don't know his last name actually, but I know who you mean.
Yeah, Jay. It's like P-H-A.
Maybe Farrow, I think.
Yeah,
Jay Farrow.
Yeah. So he's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean Saturday Night Live is full of like really good impressionists and performers. Yeah, I was quite late to the Saturday Night Live kind of reach because we didn't really have it in the UK when I was growing up. So I was raised on a lot more British humor. Which I also prefer in terms of style. But Saturday Night Live, I more got into in recent years, to be honest, maybe about 5 years ago. I started actually paying more attention to it. Yeah,
I haven't seen the latest. I mean, I don't know the new cast at all.
Yeah,
I
don't know who's I was watching some of the older ones. So the classic, like, cowbell scenes and stuff like that, and stuff like that.
You ever watched that animation, The Big Mouth, on Netflix?
Yeah, Nick Kroll. Yeah.
Nick Kroll.
Yeah, he's also good.
He's very good. He's so
good. He does
good.
loads of voices.
I mean, it's incredible that you can always eventually find the new Donald Duck.
Oh yeah,
you can find the new Daffy Duck.
I can't do Donald Duck. I find him super hard. I can make his noises.
Yeah,
but I can't.
That's
talk.
That's
like
it.
That yet.
I don't know.
So
how is it? I don't know how it's even possible. I mean,
I'm gonna practice, but it always comes out as a gargly mess.
Yeah.
I'm like, I found it, and then I try to speak, and it goes completely wrong.
Yeah, I can say like, but it doesn't come out like it should.
No, and like it's really impressive when people talk like that.
Oh yeah, so, like fluent Donald
It's one
Duck.
of those things where so I had a few voices that I couldn't do for ages, and practice does really, really help. Especially with lower voices like Optimus Prime. Like for that one, it took me ages to practice and get it right.
Let's hear it.
Before time began. And that's kind of like, you start off with this, and I have to kind of practice and practice. And I was in the shower like, before. I'm trying to get like the tone right.
The growl.
Yeah, and then you're kind of like, Autobots, roll out.
Oh yeah,
you can kind of get it there. But also the newer one is different to the older one.
Oh, do the Autobots roll out with the Joe voice, Family Guy.
Hey, Peter, Autobots, transform, and roll out.
Oh, shit. I mean, that's really good.
Day, Megatron.
And Joe is so funny that it's enough for me to hear him speak.
Yeah. And hey, Peter, how could you afford these things?
Oh my God. Oh, it's so amazing that
No, but he's in a lot of animation now as well. And his voice is just naturally so great. Like you just hear him speak and he talks like that, and it's crazy good. Like,
yeah. Oh yeah. It's
I'm not gonna do that. Just walk in and say anything.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my basic voice is a little bit geeky. I couldn't do the voice that's so deep as the Joe voice.
But again, it takes practice because when I was first doing it, I was like, "Hey, Peter," and like, "Oh,
but that's good anyway. If you that sounds like Joe anyway, even if it's not that deep.
But this is where, as a voice actor, if you want to do impressions, you usually start with key phrases, right?
Oh yeah.
So you find one that is easier to sit in, like with Patrick Stewart. Tea, Earl Grey, hot.
Oh yeah.
I always used to say that quite a lot.
Yeah.
And with Joe, it was always like, "Hey, Peter," just kind of slip into it. And Optimus Prime was always like, "Autobots, transform and roll out."
Yeah, and who's that awesome voice actor who does the amazing Morgan Freeman?
Oh, there's many, but there's one of my favorite impressionists on
he
social
done the
media. He does
tutorial.
so many.
Yeah, but the guy who did the tutorial.
Yeah, and it's really annoying me that I can't.
Yes.
Yeah.
That part.
Yeah, him.
I don't remember his name.
It's really bothering me because I do know his name.
Yeah.
But I can't think of it right now. But I follow all of his videos. He's like maybe the best impressionist that I've seen.
Yeah, and
because his range is crazy.
You know, there are some hard words for me that I cannot pronounce. I mean, my English used to be so much better. Now it's like
really awesome.
It's semi okay. I'm not happy with my English now, but you know, like 10 years ago when I used to work at the U.S. Embassy as a guard, so we used English every day, and also after the embassy period, I trained with the former ambassador. In the gym for almost 3 years.
All right.
So I got to speak English almost every day.
Yeah. I mean,
every morning at 7 a.m. we hit the gym and did the workout and had lots of fun. I told you about the suggest. So I can say that. But when you have to add the
suggestion.
Yeah. Suggest. That's fine. But suggestion. It's hard.
You have to think about it, right?
Yeah. And even if I do think about it, my tongue doesn't want to say it.
But English is such a crazy language. So this is where, like, as you know, I do these Finnish pronunciation videos as well.
Yeah.
Because I live in Finland, and you know, I find humor in everything in life in a loving way. So I love the way that Finns say certain things in English, and so I share videos on that because it also highlights how ridiculous English is as a language. Because not everything makes sense. So 1 minute it's like, you know, ed, for example, at the end of a word.
Yeah.
Sometimes you say ed and sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
So like you'd be like founded and you're like, okay, nice. And then someone will be like caged. And I'm like, no, it's caged.
Caged.
And they're like, why?
Yeah. I remember a perfect example of being in San Francisco for a vacation. And I didn't remember the name of the street that goes like that.
Oh, yeah.
And I asked some local that where is the crooked?
Oh yeah, crooked. That's a classic.
Crooked street.
Yeah, crooked street.
What? And what now? What? Yeah, no, the crooked street. Everything here is crooked, but it's
crooked.
Crooked.
Yeah, but then you have hooked.
Hooked.
So it doesn't.
It doesn't make any sense. Yeah. So I learned that like 10 years after the vacation. Oh, that's why that guy didn't know.
But then the word bow.
The what?
The word bow, B-O-W.
Oh,
like a bow and arrow.
Yeah.
Is also a bow tie.
Oh, yeah.
But the same spelling in a different context is bow.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's to bow and it's spelled the same. Same as read and read.
At first, when I saw your name, what kind of a
stupid name is
Huikea.
Huikea, yeah.
Because
Huikea.
Sam's nickname on social media is Sam Hughes VO.
Yeah.
So Huikea.
Yeah, of course, right? And then in Finnish, as you know, I have a video on this where I've had various interpretations of my last name. So the correct is obviously Hughes.
Yeah.
But I've had Huikea. Hudges. And I've also had Mr. Huge, which
you don't correct.
I don't correct people on that one. I don't.
That's awesome.
But yeah, so like it's always I've always had a fascination with accents, dialects, regional kind of like ways of saying things. Like language is just fun to me.
Yeah.
So that also comes into play with doing my impressions and accents and voices.
You know what? Time to release the Arnold.
Yeah, is it time? Is it time?
It is time.
Of course. Like anytime. I can bring him here. I can bring him there. But he's always with me. He's even a part of me now where there's been some times at home where I'm like,
oh, shit.
And it happens naturally. And I'm just like, oh no, I'm becoming him.
How often do you visit your home country?
I don't know, like a couple of times a year at least.
So you don't ever do like call?
Yeah, no, I've not done prank calls with it before.
You've done those?
No.
You should do those.
Just prank people.
Yeah. And
hey, I'd like the room service, please.
That's one of the things you can absolutely do. you can record yourself while being on the driving.
Yeah, because it's anonymous, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I've been tempted to go in.
Oh yeah, you should do that. I would so totally
one Happy
do
Meal,
that.
please.
Yeah.
It better come with a goddamn toy. This is not a Big Mac. Mac.
Arnold might be your best, but I think
he's definitely probably my best impression.
Yeah, and your Jason Statham is also.
It's not bad. It's all right. You know.
Yeah,
it's kind of closer to my original accent as well, because like I'm from Essex originally.
Oh yeah.
So my accent has changed over the years since moving around. So, but it means I can do a lot of regional dialects from England.
I was getting fed up with the Monty Python.
I knew Monty Python was coming because you. Oh well.
Then one summer,
this summer,
they aired the Holy Grail. I'm gonna give it a shot, and I started watching it, and before the starting intro and the starting subtitles and the whole
the llama stuff.
no, it was the moose. Moose
part, yes,
moose once bit my sister.
Yes.
I was, oh my god. So I was just laughing so hard. I couldn't see
so
anything.
good.
My eyes were like they were in tears. I had my face wet, and I wiped the tears, and holy shit, everything in that movie, it was amazing.
Yeah, it's very well done.
And
it's definitely their best in my opinion. And then the other ones are still great. Like Life of Brian is a second favorite, I think, for me.
Yeah, and also what was really good was their live at the Hollywood Bowl.
Yes, yeah, and their TV series as well, Flying Circus.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah. And the random stuff they do, and I don't know if they actually knew that it would work and make people laugh. I mean, how random is that? The fish slapping dance.
Yeah. And the funny walking and stuff, like they have so many random
Ministry of Funny Walks, yeah.
But they love the absurd, right?
They
did, where they really went for a lot of the humor there with like the absurdity of certain things. But it was always like a great commentary on some stuff as well.
Yeah.
So like it was pointing out ridiculous stuff, but also doing absurd stuff and pushing the boundaries of comedy, and that was what they were really all about.
Pushing the boundaries.
Yeah.
Do that with Arnold, pushing the boundaries.
Pushing the boundaries of comedy.
Okay, let's do a small sketch like improv.
Oh, no.
You're gonna be Arnold.
Okay, always, yeah.
So Arnold, what do you like in Finland?
I very much enjoy the amount of quiet. Nobody talks to me. They leave me alone. It's fantastic. I get on the metro. Everybody's far away. Nobody's in my face. Nobody's all in my grill. Like they're just there. So for context, Tommy has now asked me to read The Ugly Duckling as Arnold Schwarzenegger. So, once upon a time, on a quiet little farm, a mother duck sat on her nest. One by one, her eggs began to hatch. Quack, quack, said the fluffy yellow ducklings as they came out. But one egg was much bigger than the others. When the last egg finally cracked open, out came a big, grey duckling. He didn't look like the others at all. The other ducklings stared. "You're so big and weird," one said. "You're not cute like us," another whispered. "My dear, you may not be as pretty as your siblings, but you are just as special," Mama Duck said, giving the duckling lots of love. The grey duckling felt sad. He didn't understand why he looked different. Wherever he went, the other animals laughed at him.
How long is it?
It's very long. You can cut me whenever you want.
Okay, I think we're good. But holy shit, that's a sad story. I haven't heard it for quite some long
the
time.
Ugly Duckling. It's a very sad story.
Yeah, I mean, it's been like almost 2 weeks since I last heard it.
Well, like most, I was, not a popular kid in high school. I was a massive nerd in the 90s, so it wasn't cool then.
Yeah.
So like most people, I was not popular at school at that age when you're into nerdy things. And so I resonated quite well with the Ugly Duckling. Oh, nobody likes me.
Mm.
Yeah.
I cannot do a proper English accent. It's always like overblown. I mean,
well, most people would exaggerate an accent.
Yeah.
So like, you know, I do accents, but I try to do them well and accurate. And also any accent, you have regional and dialects and stuff like that. So kind of impact it, even if you do Irish, Scottish or Welsh or whatever.
Yeah.
Like it's not just one accent for the entire country. So, and England has like the highest amount of dialects for landmass for the English language. So like we're such a small island, but we have a ton of different accents and dialects.
Yeah, you drive 10 miles and you'll be...
Yeah, like you don't even have to go that far.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Like you can literally go 5 miles up the road and it'll be slightly different, you know?
Huh. That's crazy.
Depending where you are. So...
I think we should wrap this up. I think this could go on for 2 hours, 3 hours. There's no end of this. Maybe we should do one more. Let's see how the views go. And
I'm happy to come back. We can chat about anything.
You wanna finish us off? Is that how you say it?
I wouldn't phrase it like that if I were you.
Finish us off. You want to finish the podcast wrap this up with wise words of Patrick Warburton. It's a hard last name to pronounce.
Yeah, Warburton. Yeah.
Well, Warburton.
Warburton is the British way of saying it. Warburton is probably the American way.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So make sure you listen to the podcast and you watch on every platform you can. And I'll see you next time. Maybe.
All right. Thanks so much for joining
Tommy.
me.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it was fun.
I'll be back.